If you were to look at our life from the outside, you'd probably think we had it all. My name's Aaron, and I'm 32 years old. I've been married to Emily for 5 years now, and they've been, for the most part, the happiest years of my life. We have a life that many people only dream about. A cozy suburban house, a well-kept lawn, and even the cliché white picket fence. We share our home with Max, our overly energetic golden retriever, and Oliver, our lazy but lovable cat who rules the house from the armchair. Emily and I both work decent jobs. She's a project manager for a successful marketing firm, and I'm a software developer for a tech company downtown. Our incomes are solid enough that we can afford to take spontaneous weekend trips, renovate the house when we feel like it, and spoil Max and Oliver with the best toys and treats. But more than the material things, what made our life perfect was us, Emily and me, together. Our families were just as intertwined as we were. Emily's parents adored me. Her mom once told me I was the son-in-law she'd prayed for, and her dad? Let's just say I was the only guy he'd ever voluntarily invited to a fishing trip. On the other side, my parents treated Emily like their own daughter. My mom couldn't stop gushing about how lucky I was to marry someone so kind, smart, and beautiful. And my dad? He called her the glue that kept me from falling apart. Family holidays were always loud, full of laughter and the occasional chaos that Max and Oliver inevitably caused. But even amidst the noise, there was always this sense of belonging, this feeling that Emily and I were the center of it all. We had dreams for the future, too. Over dinner one night, Emily brought up the idea of converting the spare bedroom into a nursery. "I mean, not now," she said, smiling shyly. "But maybe next year? It'd be nice to have a little one running around. Don't you think?" I smiled back at her, reaching for her hand across the table. "Yeah," I said, "I think it would." We'd even started researching daycare options and debating baby names. It felt like the next logical step in our life together. When we weren't planning for the future, we were living in the moment. Date nights at the movies, hiking trips with Max, quiet evenings on the couch with Oliver purring in Emily's lap. It was the kind of life that felt too good to be true. And maybe it was. The cracks, when they came, were so small at first that I didn't notice them. It was little things. Emily working late more often than usual, her phone lighting up with messages she didn't seem eager to share. But I chalked it up to her job. Marketing was a high-pressure industry, and deadlines were always looming. "Work's been crazy this week," she'd say, giving me an apologetic smile as she set her phone down. And I believed her because why wouldn't I? We were happy, we were solid, and we trusted each other. One Saturday afternoon, I came home to find Emily in the backyard, tossing a tennis ball for Max while Oliver lounged on the patio, soaking up the sun. "Hey you," she said, flashing me that easy, radiant smile that always made my chest tighten. "Hey," I said, dropping my keys on the kitchen counter and stepping outside. Max ran up to me, tail wagging like crazy, and dropped the ball at my feet. I ruffled his ears, laughing as he barked excitedly. "How's the most spoiled dog in the world doing?" I teased. "Excuse me," Emily said, crossing her arms playfully. "You mean the most loved dog in the world?" I laughed, pulling her into a hug. Same thing. That evening, as we sat on the couch with a bowl of popcorn between us, I thought about how lucky I was. Emily leaned against me, her head resting on my shoulder, while Oliver sprawled out across her lap, purring loudly. "Do you ever think about how good we have it?" I asked, running my fingers through her hair. She looked up at me, her eyes sparkling. "All the time." It felt like one of those perfect moments you want to freeze in time, to hold on to forever. But looking back now, I realize how fleeting it all was. It was a quiet Thursday morning, one of those uneventful days that feels like it'll blend into the rest. Emily was upstairs, humming to herself in the shower, while I stood in the kitchen, drinking my second cup of coffee and scrolling through the news on my phone. The sound of Max barking pulled me out of my trance. He was standing by the front door, his tail wagging furiously. "That'll be the mail," I said to him, setting my mug down. All right, I'm coming." I opened the door to find our mail carrier, a cheerful older man named Frank who'd been delivering our mail for years. "Morning, Aaron," Frank said, handing me a small stack of envelopes. "Anything good today?" "Probably just bills," I joked, flipping through the pile as Max sniffed at Frank's feet. "Have a good one," Frank said with a wave, heading back to his truck. As I sorted through the mail, one envelope caught my attention. It was addressed to Emily, but what made it stand out was the handwriting. It wasn't the generic printed font of a bill or the elegant script of a wedding invitation. It was handwritten, in blue ink, with an address I recognized immediately. It was from Tom. I frowned. Tom and I had been best friends for years. If he needed to talk to me, or Emily for that matter, why not just call or text? It wasn't like him to send a letter. Curiosity got the better of me. Emily was still in the shower, and I figured it couldn't hurt to take a quick peek. I tore open the envelope, unfolding the letter inside. It was short, no more than a few paragraphs, but by the time I finished reading it, my hands were shaking. "Elena, I haven't been able to stop thinking about last weekend. Being with you feels like a dream I never want to wake up from. Every time I see you, it gets harder to keep this a secret, but I know we have to. For now, please tell me you feel the same. Tom." For a moment, I thought I must have read it wrong. This had to be some kind of joke. Tom couldn't be writing love letters to my wife. But there it was, clear as day. Emily came downstairs a few minutes later, wrapped in her robe, her hair still damp. "Morning," she said, smiling as she poured herself a cup of coffee. "What's on the agenda for today?" I didn't answer. My mind was racing, my chest tightening with every second that passed. "Aaron?" she said, her smile faltering. "What's wrong?" I didn't say anything. Instead, I slid the letter across the table toward her. "What's this?" she asked, frowning as she picked it up. "You tell me," I said, my voice colder than I'd intended. Her eyes scanned the letter, and I watched as her face went pale. "This isn't, Aaron, this isn't what it looks like," she said quickly, her voice trembling. "Then what is it?" I demanded. "Because it looks like my best friend is writing love letters to my wife." "It's not for me," she said, shaking her head. "Look at the name. He doesn't even call me Emily." I glanced at the letter again, my mind racing. She was right, the letter didn't use her name. Instead, it was addressed to someone named Elena. "So what?" I snapped. "You're telling me it's just a coincidence that Tom sent a love letter to someone named Elena, and it ended up in our mailbox?" "It must be," she said, her voice rising. "Maybe the mailman mixed up the addresses. Aaron, you have to believe me. I would never do this to you." Her words were desperate, her eyes wide with fear. For a moment, I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that this was all some kind of mistake, that the woman I'd built my life with couldn't possibly be lying to me. But the doubt lingered. "I'm calling Tom," I said, pulling out my phone. "No, wait," Emily started, but it was too late. Tom picked up on the second ring. "Hey man," he said, his tone casual. "We need to talk," I said, cutting straight to the point. "I got a letter today. From you. Addressed to Emily." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "That wasn't meant for her," Tom said finally, his voice strained. "Then who was it meant for?" I demanded. "There's this girl I've been seeing," he said quickly. "Her name's Elena. I must have written the wrong address by mistake. I swear, Aaron, this has nothing to do with Emily." His explanation was clumsy, but it made sense. Or at least I wanted it to make sense. When I hung up, Emily was watching me, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. "What did he say?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "He said it wasn't meant for you," I said. "That it was for someone else." She exhaled sharply, relief flooding her face. "See? I told you. It's just a misunderstanding." But even as she smiled, I couldn't shake the gnawing feeling in my chest. Over the next few days, I tried to push the letter out of my mind. Emily acted like everything was normal, going about her day as if nothing had happened. But something had shifted between us. I started noticing little things, her phone lighting up with messages she quickly dismissed, the way she seemed distracted during dinner, her sudden need to work late more often than usual. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make me wonder. When I finally told my dad about the letter, he didn't hesitate. "If you think something's going on, you need to figure it out," he said. "I don't know, Dad," I said, rubbing the back of my neck. "What if I'm just being paranoid?" "Then you'll know for sure," he said. "But if you're right, you deserve to know the truth." And just like that, we had a plan. If there's one thing I've learned about doubt, it's that it doesn't grow quietly. It starts small, like a single crack in a window pane, but before you know it, the whole thing shatters. After the letter incident, I couldn't look at Emily the same way. I wanted to believe her, I really did. But every time her phone buzzed or she mentioned working late, my stomach twisted. I told myself I was being paranoid. Tom's explanation had made sense, hadn't it? The letter wasn't even addressed to her. Emily loved me and I loved her. That should have been enough. But it wasn't. "Still thinking about it?" my dad asked one evening as we sat in his living room. "Yeah," I admitted, staring into the amber liquid in my glass. My dad had always been the one I turned to when life got complicated. He was the kind of guy who never panicked, who could see a problem from every angle and figure out a solution before anyone else even knew there was a problem. "I don't want to be the guy who doesn't trust his wife," I said finally. "But I also don't want to be the guy who ignores the signs and ends up looking like an idiot." "You're not an idiot," my dad said firmly. "But if you want peace of mind, you need to know the truth." I nodded, the weight of his words settling over me. "So how do I find out?" "We watch," he said simply. And so we watched. It started small. Just me paying closer attention to Emily's schedule, noticing when she left the house and when she came back. I didn't want to believe she was hiding anything, but the little inconsistencies started adding up. One Friday evening, Emily told me she had a late meeting at work. "Don't wait up," she said, kissing me on the cheek as she grabbed her bag. "It might go late." I nodded, forcing a smile. "Okay, see you later." As soon as she left, I called my dad. "She just left," I said. "Said she's going to work." "You want to follow her?" he asked. "Yeah," I said, my heart pounding. We waited until she was a few minutes ahead before getting into my car. My dad sat in the passenger seat, his eyes scanning the road as I tried to keep a safe distance. Emily's car turned onto the highway, heading downtown. "She really could be going to work," I said, more to myself than to my dad. "Maybe," he said, "but let's find out." Her car eventually pulled into the parking lot of a small cafe, not her office building. We parked a few spaces away, watching as she stepped out of her car. She was dressed casually, her hair tied back in a ponytail. She didn't look like someone heading to a work meeting. A few minutes later, another car pulled up, and my stomach dropped. It was Tom. I gripped the steering wheel tightly as Tom got out of his car and walked toward the cafe. Emily smiled when she saw him, and they hugged briefly before going inside. "She could be meeting him for something innocent," my dad said cautiously. "Yeah," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. We sat there for over an hour, watching as they talked and laughed through the cafe window. Every time Emily leaned forward or touched Tom's arm, it felt like a knife twisting in my chest. When they finally left, they went their separate ways, Emily back to her car and Tom to his. "She's not going to work," I said, my voice hollow. "No," my dad agreed. "She's not." That night, I confronted her. "How was work?" I asked casually as she walked through the door. "It was fine," she said, setting her bag down. "Long, but productive." I nodded, my jaw tightening. "Really? Because I thought I saw you at that cafe downtown. With Tom." Emily froze, her face pale. You followed me? Don't turn this around on me," I snapped. "What were you doing there?" "It's not what you think," she said quickly. "We were just talking. That's all." "Talking about what?" I demanded. "About you," she said, her voice rising. "I was upset. Okay? I've been feeling like we're drifting apart, and I didn't know how to talk to you about it. So I went to Tom for advice." "Advice?" I repeated, my chest tightening. "Yes," she said, tears welling in her eyes. "That's all it was. I swear, Aaron." I wanted to believe her, The way she looked at me, her voice trembling with emotion, it all felt real. But the seed of doubt had already been planted, and it was growing faster than I could control. "Okay," I said finally, my voice flat. "But if I find out you're lying?" "I'm not," she said, stepping closer. "I love you, Aaron. I would never hurt you." Her words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. For now, I let it go. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. The next day, I met my dad at his house. "She says they were just talking," I said, pacing the length of the living room. "And do you believe her?" my dad asked. "I don't know," I admitted. He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Then we keep watching." After that night, everything between Emily and me felt fragile. We went through the motions, dinner together, cuddling on the couch, taking Max for walks. But the warmth we used to have was gone. I didn't want to admit it, but the letter and her meeting with Tom had changed everything. She said she loved me. She said she'd never hurt me. But the doubt was like a splinter under my skin, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't ignore it. The following week, my dad and I continued our quiet investigation. We kept things low-key, watching for anything that might confirm or disprove my suspicions. Emily's late-night work meetings continued, and every time she left the house, my chest tightened. One evening, as she was getting ready to go, I casually asked, "Where's the meeting tonight?" She hesitated for just a moment before saying, "Downtown. Same client as last week." I nodded, pretending to believe her. But as soon as she walked out the door, I grabbed my phone and called my dad. "She's gone," I said. "Let's see where she's really going." We followed her car at a safe distance, my dad directing me as I drove. "Don't get too close," he said, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "I know," I muttered, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. Emily turned onto the highway, heading in the direction of downtown. For a moment, I thought she might actually be telling the truth. But then she took an exit that didn't lead to her office. "Where's she going?" I asked, my pulse quickening. "Let's find out," my dad said grimly. Her car pulled into the parking lot of a small, boutique hotel. I parked a few spaces away, watching as she stepped out of her car and walked toward the entrance. She wasn't carrying her work bag, just a small clutch that didn't seem to fit the image of someone heading to a meeting. My dad and I exchanged a look. "What now?" I asked. "We wait," he said. An hour passed, then two. Finally, the door to the hotel opened, and my stomach dropped. Emily stepped out, her hair slightly disheveled, followed by Tom. They didn't touch, but the way they stood close to each other, talking in hushed tones, was enough to make my blood boil. My dad put a hand on my arm, stopping me from getting out of the car. "Not here," he said firmly. "You don't want to make a scene." I nodded reluctantly, my jaw clenched so tightly it hurt. That night, Emily came home looking calm and collected, as if nothing had happened. "How was your meeting?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. "Good," she said, kicking off her heels. "Long, but productive." I forced a smile, even as anger and betrayal churned in my gut. For the first time in our marriage, I didn't kiss her goodnight. The next day, I couldn't focus on anything. Work emails piled up, and Max followed me around the house, his tail wagging hopefully, but I couldn't bring myself to play with him. Even Oliver seemed to sense something was wrong, curling up in the corner instead of his usual spot on the couch. By the time evening rolled around, I couldn't take it anymore. I called Tom. "We need to talk," I said, my voice cold. "Sure," he said, sounding cautious. "What's up?" "Come over," I said. "Now." When Tom arrived, I didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Are you sleeping with my wife?" I demanded, my voice shaking with anger. Tom's eyes widened. "What? No, Aaron, I would never." "Don't lie to me," I snapped. "I saw you with her at the hotel last night." Tom froze, his face pale. "I can explain." "Then explain," I said, cutting him off. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Emily's been unhappy. She told me she felt like you were drifting apart, and she didn't know how to fix it. She asked me to meet her, so we could talk about how to help you two reconnect. I stared at him, my mind racing. His explanation sounded rehearsed. Too neat to be true. And the hotel? I asked, my voice dripping with skepticism. She didn't want anyone to see us and get the wrong idea, he said quickly. Aaron, I swear, nothing's going on. I'd never do that to you. When Emily came home later that night, I confronted her again. Tom told me everything, I said, my arms crossed. Her face flushed, and for a moment, she looked panicked. But then she composed herself. Good, she said, her voice steady. Because now you know there's nothing to worry about. Her calmness only made me angrier. I don't believe you, I said. What do you want me to say, Aaron? She asked, tears welling in her eyes. That I'm sorry for confiding in someone who actually listened to me? That I'm sorry for trying to fix our marriage. Her words stung, but they didn't erase the image of her and Tom leaving that hotel together. The following week was tense. Emily and I barely spoke, and when we did, it was strained and awkward. My dad and I continued watching, but Emily and Tom were careful. They didn't slip up, didn't leave any clues that could confirm what I already suspected. Until they did. It was a Saturday afternoon when it happened. Emily told me she was going to visit a friend across town, but when I called that friend later, she said she hadn't seen Emily in weeks. My dad and I followed her again, this time to a different hotel. We waited in the car, watching as she and Tom walked in together, laughing and looking far too comfortable for two people who were supposedly just talking. This time I didn't wait. Let's go, I said, my voice filled with cold determination. My dad nodded, and together, we walked toward the hotel entrance, ready to end this charade once and for all. Walking into that hotel felt like stepping into a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. My dad and I moved quickly but quietly, weaving through the lobby and ignoring the curious glances from the receptionist. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, and I punched the button for the 4th floor, my chest tight with a mix of anger and dread. Are you sure you want to do this? My dad asked, his voice low. I have to, I said through clenched teeth. The elevator ride felt endless, each floor ticking by like an eternity. When the doors finally opened, we stepped out into a quiet hallway lined with identical doors. Room 412. That was the room they'd walked into. We stood outside the door, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. What if you're wrong? My dad asked, his hand on my shoulder. I'm not, I said, shaking him off. Without another word, I raised my fist and pounded on the door. There was a pause, followed by the muffled sound of voices. I heard movement, quick, frantic, before the door cracked open. It was Tom. His face went pale the moment he saw me. Aaron, what are you? I didn't let him finish. I pushed the door open, my dad following close behind. The room was small but tidy, with a single bed pushed against the far wall. And there, standing by the window, was Emily. She was wearing the same dress she'd left the house in, but her hair was slightly mussed, and her face was flushed. Aaron, she said, her voice trembling. This isn't what it looks like. I laughed bitterly, the sound harsh and empty. Really? Because it looks like my wife and my best friend booked a hotel room together. Tom stepped forward, his hands raised defensively. Aaron, listen. Don't, I snapped, cutting him off. I don't want to hear another word from you. Emily started crying, tears streaming down her face as she clutched the edge of the bed. I'm so sorry, she said, her voice breaking. I never wanted to hurt you. Then why did you do it? I demanded, my voice shaking. Why him? She looked at me, her eyes filled with guilt and desperation. Because I was lonely, Aaron. You're always so busy with work, and I felt like you didn't see me anymore. Tom was there when I needed someone. Her words hit me like a sledgehammer. That's your excuse? I said, my voice dripping with disbelief. I didn't pay enough attention to you, so you decided to sleep with my best friend? Tom stepped forward again, his face a mixture of shame and defiance. I didn't mean for this to happen, he said. But she was unhappy, Aaron. She needed someone, and I didn't know how to say no. You didn't know how to say no? I repeated, my anger boiling over. Are you kidding me, Tom? You betrayed me. My dad stepped between us before I could do something I'd regret. Let's go, he said, his voice calm but firm. I stared at Emily for a long moment, waiting for her to say something, anything, that could undo the damage she'd done. But she just stood there, crying silently as Tom hovered nearby like a shield. Finally, I turned and walked out, my dad close behind. The drive home was silent. My dad didn't say a word, and I didn't trust myself to speak. My mind was racing, replaying everything that had led up to this moment. The letter, the late-night meetings, the lies. When we got back to the house, I sat on the couch, staring at the blank TV screen as Max rested his head on my knee. Oliver jumped up beside me, curling into a ball like he always did. For a moment, their presence was comforting. But then the weight of what had happened crashed over me again, and I felt like I couldn't breathe. Emily came home later that night. I didn't look at her as she walked through the door. She stood in the hallway for a moment before cautiously stepping into the living room. Aaron, she said softly. I didn't respond. I know you're angry, she continued, and you have every right to be. But I love you. What happened with Tom? It was a mistake. It didn't mean anything. I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. Didn't mean anything? You've been sneaking around behind my back for weeks, and you're telling me it didn't mean anything? She sat down on the couch, keeping a careful distance between us. I know I messed up, but I want to fix this. I want to fix us. Her words should have made me feel something. Anger, sadness, hope. But all I felt was numb. How do you fix something like this? I asked, my voice flat. I'll do whatever it takes, she said, her voice trembling. Counseling, therapy, whatever you want. Just don't give up on us. For a moment, I thought about it. I thought about the life we'd built together, the plans we'd made, the love we used to share. But then I thought about Tom and the hotel and the lies, and I knew I couldn't do it. I need time, I said finally, standing up. Emily looked at me, her eyes pleading. Aaron, please. I can't do this right now, I said, cutting her off. Just leave me alone. She nodded slowly, tears streaming down her face as she stood and walked upstairs. As the sound of her footsteps faded, I sat back down on the couch, Max and Oliver by my side. For the first time in my life, I felt completely, utterly lost. The days that followed felt like I was living in a fog. Emily tried to act normal, going about her day as if nothing had happened. She still cooked dinner, still kissed me goodbye in the mornings, still curled up on the couch with Max and Oliver like everything was fine. But it wasn't fine. I couldn't look at her without seeing her standing in that hotel room with Tom. I couldn't hear her voice without remembering the lies she'd told me. Every time her phone buzzed, my chest tightened. Even though she made a point of leaving it on the counter where I could see it, it was like we were living in two different worlds. Hers, where she was trying to pretend we could fix this, and mine, where everything felt broken beyond repair. At work, I couldn't focus. Emails went unanswered, deadlines were missed, and more than once, I caught my coworkers giving me concerned looks during meetings. You okay, man? My manager, Kyle, asked one afternoon as I stared blankly at my computer screen. Yeah, I lied, forcing a smile. Just a lot on my mind. He nodded, but I could tell he didn't believe me. At home, things weren't much better. Emily was trying too hard, honestly. She asked me how my day was, made my favorite meals, even suggested we take Max to the park together like we used to. But every time I looked at her, all I could think about was how she'd betrayed me. One evening, as we sat at the dinner table, I finally snapped. Why are you doing this? I asked, setting down my fork. Emily looked up at me, her expression cautious. Doing what? Acting like everything's fine, I said, my voice sharper than I intended. Because I'm trying, Aaron, she said, her voice trembling. I'm trying to fix this, to fix us. I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. You can't fix this, Emily. You broke it. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't say anything. The only thing that kept me grounded was Max and Oliver. Max seemed to sense that something was wrong. He followed me around the house, his tail wagging hopefully whenever I looked at him. Oliver, ever the aloof one, started curling up beside me on the couch, purring softly as if trying to comfort me. But even their presence couldn't erase the anger and sadness that had settled in my chest. Then, one evening, everything got worse. I came home to find Emily sitting on the floor in the living room, her face buried in her hands. Max lay beside her, motionless. "What happened?" I asked, my voice shaking as I dropped my bag and ran to her side. He wasn't eating this morning," Emily said, her voice barely a whisper. "I thought it was just his stomach. But, Aaron, he's gone." I stared at Max, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. He'd been fine just yesterday, chasing a tennis ball around the yard like he always did. But now he was gone, his once bright eyes dull and lifeless. The next few days were unbearable. We buried Max in the backyard, near the tree where he loved to nap in the shade. Emily cried the entire time, but I couldn't. I felt like I'd already run out of tears. Oliver seemed to sense the loss too. He stopped eating, stopped purring, stopped doing much of anything. I tried to comfort him, to coax him into eating, but nothing worked. A week later, I found him curled up in his favorite chair, completely still. Losing Max had been hard enough. Losing Oliver felt like the final blow. After we buried Oliver next to Max, I sat on the back porch, staring at the two little graves beneath the tree. Emily came out a few minutes later, her face streaked with tears. "I'm so sorry," she said, sitting beside me. "I know how much they meant to you." "They meant everything to me," I said quietly. We sat in silence for a while, the weight of our grief pressing down on us. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I realized something. I couldn't keep living like this. Emily's betrayal, the loss of Max and Oliver, the constant weight of doubt and anger. It was all too much. I needed answers, closure, something to help me move forward one way or another. The next morning, I called my dad. "I need your help," I said. "Anything," he replied. "I want to know if she's still seeing him," I said, my voice firm. "I need to know the truth." He didn't hesitate. "All right, let's do it." Over the next few days, we watched Emily's every move. She didn't seem to notice, going about her routine like normal. But my dad and I were careful, staying just far enough behind to avoid suspicion. Finally, on a quiet Thursday afternoon, we caught her. She left the house around 3 p.m., saying she was going to run errands. But instead of heading to the grocery store or the mall, she drove to a small motel on the edge of town. We parked across the street, watching as she got out of her car and walked inside. 10 minutes later, Tom arrived. My chest tightened as I watched them walk into the motel together, laughing and talking like nothing was wrong. "This is it," my dad said, his voice grim. "You ready?" I nodded, my jaw clenched. "Let's go." The motel smelled like stale air and bad decisions. My dad and I walked quickly down the narrow hallway, the muted hum of an old vending machine buzzing in the background. The carpet was a dull brown, worn thin in places, and the faint sound of a TV seeped through the walls. Room 206. That was where they'd gone. I stopped outside the door, my hand hovering over the doorknob. My dad stood beside me, his face calm but his eyes sharp, watching me closely. "You sure about this?" he asked. I nodded, my jaw tight. "I need to know." I knocked hard enough to make the cheap wood rattle. There was a shuffle inside, followed by muffled voices. "Who is it?" came Tom's voice, strained and nervous. "It's me," I said, my voice low but firm. "Open the door." There was a long pause, and then the sound of a lock clicking. The door opened a crack, and Tom's face appeared. "Aaron, this isn't." I didn't let him finish. I pushed the door open, stepping inside with my dad right behind me. The room was small, just a bed, a TV bolted to the wall, and a cheap-looking nightstand. And there, sitting on the edge of the bed, was Emily. Her hair was messy, her face flushed. She was still wearing the dress she'd left the house in, but her shoes were off, and the way she looked at me, wide-eyed and frozen. told me everything I needed to know. Aaron, she started, her voice shaking. This isn't what it looks like. I laughed bitterly, the sound harsh and hollow. Really? Because it looks exactly like what I thought it was. Tom raised his hands, like he was surrendering. Look, man, we can explain. Shut up, I snapped, cutting him off. I turned to Emily, my chest tight with anger and hurt. Why? I asked, my voice breaking. Why him? Why do this to me? She stood up, her hands trembling. Aaron, don't, I said, my voice rising. Don't you dare try to explain this away. I want the truth, Emily. I deserve that much. For a moment, she just stood there, tears streaming down her face. Then, finally, she spoke. I didn't mean for it to happen, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. It started out as nothing, just talking. But then what? I demanded. You decided to sleep with my best friend? She flinched at my words, but she didn't deny them. Tom stepped forward, his expression a mix of shame and defiance. She was unhappy, he said, his voice defensive. She felt like you didn't see her anymore, like you didn't care. I was just trying to be there for her. By sneaking around behind my back? I shot back, my anger boiling over. You were supposed to be my friend, Tom. You were supposed to have my back. I didn't want to hurt you, he said, his voice breaking. I swear, Aaron, I didn't mean for this to happen. I stared at him, the man I'd once trusted more than anyone, and felt nothing but disgust. Emily stepped closer, her hands reaching for mine, but I stepped back. I love you, she said desperately. Aaron, I know I messed up, but I love you. Please, we can fix this. We can fix this. I interrupted, laughing bitterly. How do you fix something like this, Emily? You broke us. You broke everything. Her tears fell harder, but I didn't care. Couldn't. My dad, who had been silent the whole time, finally spoke. We should go, he said, his voice steady but firm. I nodded, my chest heaving as I turned toward the door. Emily's voice stopped me. Aaron, wait, she said, her voice trembling. Please, don't do this. I turned back to her, my heart aching in a way I couldn't describe. You did this, Emily, I said quietly. Not me. And with that, I walked out. The drive home was silent, the tension in the car thick enough to choke on. When we pulled into my driveway, my dad turned to me, his expression unreadable. You did the right thing, he said. I nodded, though it didn't feel like it. Nothing about this felt right. That night, the house felt emptier than ever. Max and Oliver were gone, and now Emily's presence felt like a ghost haunting every room. I sat on the couch, staring at the blank TV screen, and wondered how everything had gone so wrong. Part of me wanted to forgive her, to believe that we could somehow move past this. But the other part of me, the part that couldn't forget the lies and the betrayal, knew better. This wasn't something you could come back from. The next morning, Emily was gone. She left a note on the kitchen counter, apologizing again and saying she'd stay with her parents for a while. She ended the note with, I love you, Aaron. Please don't give up on us. I crumpled it up and threw it in the trash. For the first time in years, I was alone. I didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. Nothing would ever be the same. The days after Emily left were the hardest I've ever experienced. The house was too quiet. Max and Oliver were gone. Emily was gone. And even though the betrayal was still fresh, I couldn't help but miss her presence. The routine of our life together, her humming in the mornings, the way she laughed at my terrible jokes, the way she curled up next to me during thunderstorms, was gone, leaving an emptiness I didn't know how to fill. I threw myself into work, staying late at the office and volunteering for every project I could find. Anything to avoid coming home to the silence. My coworkers noticed, of course, but no one said anything. Aaron, you okay? Kyle asked one afternoon, leaning against the wall of my cubicle. Yeah, I said, forcing a smile. Just busy. He nodded, but the concern in his eyes lingered. At night, I couldn't sleep. I'd lie awake for hours, replaying everything that had happened, trying to make sense of it. How had I missed the signs? How had I not seen what was happening right in front of me? The anger would come in waves, sharp and bitter, followed by a crushing sadness that left me feeling hollow. One night, I grabbed my phone and scrolled through my photos, looking at pictures of Emily and me from happier times. There we were at the beach, laughing as Max ran circles around us. There we were on a hike, Emily smiling as Oliver perched on her shoulder like a parrot. I threw the phone across the room, the screen cracking as it hit the wall. My dad checked in on me often, bringing over food and sitting with me in the evenings, even when I had nothing to say. "You don't have to do this, you know," I told him one night as we sat on the porch, a beer in each of our hands. "Do what?" he asked. "Babysit me," I said bitterly. He shook his head, his expression calm. "I'm not babysitting you, Aaron. I'm just here. And you don't have to go through this alone." His words hit me harder than I expected, and for the first time in days, I felt a flicker of something other than anger or sadness. Emily texted me once, a simple message that read, "I'm so sorry. I love you." I stared at it for a long time before deleting it without replying. Tom, on the other hand, didn't even try to reach out. Maybe he knew better, or maybe he was just as much of a coward as I thought he was. Either way, I was grateful for the silence. A week after Emily left, I finally decided to pack up her things. I started with her clothes, folding them neatly and placing them in boxes, even though every piece felt like a punch to the gut. Her favorite sweater, the one she always wore on chilly mornings, the dress she wore on our first anniversary. Then came the photos. I took them off the walls, off the shelves, and stuffed them into a drawer where I wouldn't have to see them anymore. By the time I was finished, the house felt even emptier than before. A few days later, my dad came over with a stack of old photo albums. "I thought these might help," he said, setting them down on the coffee table. I opened the first one cautiously, not sure what to expect. Inside were pictures from my childhood, family vacations, birthday parties, Christmas mornings. There was one of me holding Max as a puppy, his fur a ball of golden fluff. Another of me holding Oliver, his tiny kitten paws batting at the camera. For the first time in what felt like forever, I smiled. That night, I dreamed about Max and Oliver. In the dream, we were back at the beach, the waves crashing against the shore as Max barked excitedly and chased a seagull. Oliver sat on a rock nearby, watching with his usual aloofness, but his tail twitched in amusement. When I woke up, my chest ached, but the dream had brought me a strange sense of peace. Emily's parents called me a few times, their voices full of concern. "We're so sorry, Aaron," her mom said during one call. "We had no idea things were so bad." "It's not your fault," I said, my voice flat. Her dad, ever the practical one, asked if I needed help with anything, money, legal advice, anything at all. "I'm fine," I said, though I wasn't sure if it was true. One evening, as I sat on the porch with my dad, I finally asked the question that had been weighing on me since the beginning. "Do you think I'll ever get over this?" He was quiet for a long moment before answering. "I think it'll always hurt," he said honestly. "But pain fades, and eventually you'll find something, or someone, that makes it hurt a little less." His words lingered with me long after he left. The next morning, I got up early and went for a walk. The air was crisp, the sun just starting to rise, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. As I walked through the neighborhood, I passed the park where Max used to chase squirrels and the corner cafe where Emily and I used to have breakfast on lazy Sundays. The memories were still sharp, but they didn't cut as deeply as they had before. Maybe my dad was right. Maybe one day this would hurt less. The weeks turned into months. Life didn't get easier overnight, it never does. But little by little, I started to rebuild. The mornings felt less heavy, the nights less endless. The anger that had consumed me after the motel finally began to fade, replaced by something quieter. It wasn't forgiveness, not for Emily and certainly not for Tom. But it was acceptance. Acceptance that what was done couldn't be undone. That some wounds would leave scars no matter how much time passed. I threw myself into work again, but this time, it wasn't just to distract myself. I wanted to build something, to prove to myself that I was more than what had happened to me. My manager noticed the shift almost immediately. "Good to see you back," Kyle said during a meeting one afternoon. "Feels good to be back," I replied, and for the first time in months, it felt like the truth. At home, the silence was still there, but it wasn't as suffocating as it used to be. I adopted a rescue dog, a shy mutt named Rosie with big brown eyes and a tail that wagged hesitantly whenever I walked into the room. She wasn't Max, and I didn't expect her to be, but she was company, and slowly she started to feel like home. One weekend, my dad convinced me to join him for a fishing trip. The cabin by the lake was the same one we'd gone to when I was a kid, and the memories hit me hard as we unpacked the car. But instead of feeling overwhelmed, I let them wash over me. As we sat by the water that evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, my dad handed me a beer and said, "You're stronger than you think, you know?" I didn't say anything, but his words stayed with me long after the trip was over. Emily tried to reach out a few more times. First, it was a text on my birthday. "Thinking of you today. I hope you're okay." Then, a voicemail a week later. "Aaron, I want to talk. Please, call me." I didn't reply. I didn't delete the messages either, but I didn't listen to them again. Tom, predictably, didn't reach out at all. I heard through mutual friends that he'd left town, moved to another city to start fresh. It didn't surprise me. Running away was easier than facing the mess he'd made. Part of me wanted to track him down, to confront him one last time. But what would it change? The damage was already done. One evening, as Rosie and I walked through the park, I saw a couple sitting on a bench, their golden retriever lying at their feet. The sight hit me like a punch to the chest, memories of Max flooding back all at once. But instead of turning away, I stopped and watched them for a moment. The dog barked happily, wagging its tail as the couple laughed. For the first time in a long time, I smiled. By the time fall rolled around, I felt like I was finally finding my footing. I started going out with friends again, saying yes to invitations instead of making excuses to stay home. At first, it felt strange, like I was stepping into a world I no longer belonged to. But the more I pushed myself, the easier it became. One evening, as I sat at a bar with Kyle and a few coworkers, a woman approached our table. "Excuse me," she said, smiling shyly. "Is this seat taken?" She wasn't Emily. Her hair was darker, her eyes a deeper shade of blue, but there was something about her smile that felt warm and familiar, like sunlight breaking through a storm. "No," I said, gesturing to the empty chair. "It's all yours." We started talking about work, about movies, about the terrible weather that week. Her name was Claire, and she had a laugh that made my chest ache in the best way possible. For the first time since everything had fallen apart, I felt a flicker of something I thought I'd lost forever: hope. That night, as I walked Rosie through the quiet streets, I thought about Claire. I didn't know if she was just a passing moment or something more, but for the first time in months, I felt like the future wasn't something to fear. It was something to look forward to. It's funny how life keeps going, even when you think it's come to a standstill. Months turned into a year, and though the scars of what happened with Emily and Tom hadn't disappeared, they didn't define me anymore. I still carried the memories with me, but they were quieter now, like background noise that faded as time went on. Rosie became my anchor. She was still shy around strangers, but at home, she transformed into a playful, loving companion. Every morning, she'd nudge me awake with her cold nose, her tail wagging like she was reminding me there was still good in the world. And she was right. Claire and I started seeing each other more regularly after that night at the bar. It wasn't anything serious at first, just casual dinners and long conversations about everything and nothing. But the more time we spent together, the more I found myself looking forward to her texts, her laugh, the way she always noticed the little things. One evening, as we walked through the park with Rosie trotting happily beside us, she turned to me and said, "You're different, you know that?" "Different how?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. She smiled, her eyes warm. "You've been through a lot, but you don't let it make you bitter. Most people would." Her words caught me off guard. I wanted to tell her that I wasn't as strong as she thought, that there were nights when the weight of it all still felt unbearable. But instead, I just said, thanks, and hoped she could see the gratitude in my eyes. Emily's name came up less and less as time went on. Every now and then, someone would mention her in passing, how she was doing, where she was living. I found out she'd moved back in with her parents for a while before getting her own place in another town. I didn't ask for details. There were moments when I thought about reaching out to her, not to rekindle anything, but to tell her that I forgave her. Not for her sake, but for mine. But every time the thought crossed my mind, I stopped myself. Some doors are better left closed. One Saturday afternoon, as I cleaned out the last of the boxes in the garage, I found an old photo album Emily and I had made during our first year of marriage. For a moment, I debated throwing it away. But instead, I sat down on the floor and flipped through the pages. There we were at the Grand Canyon, both of us sunburned and laughing as Max tried to steal a sandwich from my backpack. There we were at Christmas, Emily holding Oliver like a baby while Max wore a ridiculous reindeer sweater. The memories didn't hurt as much as I thought they would. Instead, they reminded me of what we'd once had. A life that was good, even if it didn't last. When I closed the album, I didn't feel sad. I felt grateful. That evening, Claire came over for dinner. She brought a bottle of wine and a new toy for Rosie, who wagged her tail so hard I thought she might knock something over. We ate on the patio, the warm glow of the string lights casting soft shadows across the table. As we talked and laughed, I realized something. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't angry at Emily or Tom, or even at myself. The pain was still there, but it had softened, leaving room for something new. After dinner, as Claire helped me clean up, she glanced at the photo album sitting on the counter. "What's this?" she asked, picking it up. "An old album," I said. "From another life." She looked at me carefully, as if trying to read my expression. "Do you want to talk about it?" "Not tonight," I said, smiling softly. She nodded, setting the album down and taking my hand. "Okay." And just like that, I knew I'd finally found peace. Life didn't turn out the way I thought it would. I didn't have the perfect marriage or the life I'd planned with Emily. I'd lost friends, pets, and pieces of myself along the way. But I'd also gained something: perspective, strength, and the knowledge that even when everything falls apart, it's possible to rebuild. As Rosie curled up at my feet that night and Claire leaned her head on my shoulder, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope.